Frank Wilson's Corner Grocery had served the neighborhood for decades. When three strangers began demanding protection money, the elderly shopkeeper hoped they'd eventually leave him alone. One evening, as the thugs cornered him, demanding $500, Frank made a desperate phone call. When the door chimed 20 minutes later, the smirks on the thugs' faces instantly vanished. In the small town of Oak Ridge, nestled between tall oaks and family homes, stood a modest corner grocery store. For 40 years, Frank Wilson had been the beating heart of this establishment, opening the doors at 6 sharp every morning without fail. At 72, his once strong hands now showed the twisted evidence of arthritis, and his back had developed a slight stoop from decades of stocking shelves and carrying inventory. But age hadn't diminished Frank's spirit. He knew every customer by name, remembered their children's birthdays, and understood when families needed a little extra time to pay. His store wasn't just a business, it was a cornerstone of the community where neighbors gathered, shared news, and found a friendly face during difficult times. The trouble began 6 months ago, when the abandoned warehouse across the street suddenly sprouted new signs of life. Workers came and went, but Frank noticed 3 young men who seemed different from the rest. They would enter his store and look around as if observing something. At first, they purchased small items, energy drinks, cigarettes, and the occasional lottery ticket. But soon their visits took on a different tone. They lingered by the register, making idle comments that carried veiled threats. How unfortunate it would be if something happened to such a nice establishment. Frank tried to dismiss their comments as meaningless talk from bored young men. But deep down, he recognized the threat for what it was. His suspicions were confirmed when the tallest of the 3 approached him one quiet afternoon, explaining that for a small fee of $20 a week, they could ensure his store remained safe from any unfortunate incidents. Protection money. Frank had heard about such schemes, but never imagined he would become a target. Reluctantly, he handed over the first payment, hoping it would be enough to make them leave him alone. But like a hungry predator that tastes blood, their demands only grew. $20 became $40, then $60. When the amount jumped to $100 weekly, Frank finally refused. His small profit margins couldn't sustain such payments, and decades of hard work had taught him to stand his ground. The men left without a word that day. The next morning, Frank arrived to find his delivery van vandalized, all 4 tires slashed and windows shattered. Frank called the police. The young officer who responded took pictures, filled out a report, and spoke sympathetic words. But when Frank explained his suspicions about who was responsible, the officer's eyes darted nervously toward the warehouse. He suggested Frank might consider selling the business and retiring. Other shop owners in the area began to whisper similar stories: mysterious accidents, increasing demands for protection money, police reports that led nowhere. Some had already closed their businesses, others paid in silence. Nobody wanted to speak openly, fearing retaliation. Frank's options were dwindling. He hasn't spoken to his son Michael in years, not since their argument after the funeral. Neighborhood friends offered sympathy, but kept their distance, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Was this how 40 years of service to the community would end? Frank wondered as he counted the meager day's earnings on Tuesday evening. The bell above the door jingled as he was preparing to close. Looking up, his heart sank as the 3 men entered, spreading out through the small store with practiced precision. The leader approached the counter while his companions blocked the exit and began knocking items off shelves. Their message didn't need words. This was an escalation, a demonstration of power. Frank stood his ground behind the counter, though his arthritic hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge for support. The leader leaned forward, invading Frank's personal space. He explained that Frank now owed $500, what he called an accumulated debt, plus penalties for refusing to pay their protection fees. The amount would only increase if he continued to resist or contacted the police again. But as he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushed against his phone. A thought occurred to him. Not a solution, perhaps, but a final act of defiance. With deliberate movements that belied his fear, Frank pulled out his phone. The thugs watched with amused expressions, assuming he was retrieving cash or perhaps a hidden key to a safe. Instead, Frank scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in years. He pressed the name and activated the speakerphone. The thugs exchanged confused glances as the phone rang, clearly not understanding what the old man was doing. A concerned voice answered, asking what was wrong. Frank spoke his son's name, Michael, and said he needed help at the store. The simplicity of the message carried the weight of years of unspoken words between father and son. The thugs laughed openly at Frank's desperate call. One of them mentioned that the local cops were already in their pocket. Another sneered that they weren't worried about some son they could easily handle. The leader even suggested they'd wait for this Michael to arrive. 20 tense minutes followed. The men grew increasingly agitated, continuing to ransack the store while Frank sat silently on a stool, watching decades of work being destroyed. They deliberately broke items in front of him, making it clear they were willing to wait for his son to arrive just to demonstrate their power over the Wilson family completely. When headlights flashed through the front window, the thugs barely glanced up. The bell above the door chimed once more. The three men turned casually, perhaps expecting another elderly resident they could intimidate. But their expressions quickly shifted from casual arrogance to stunned surprise. Michael Wilson entered, not in casual clothes as the thugs might have expected, but in the crisp uniform of the city's police department. No one in the room could have predicted what happened next, as this confrontation connected two separate worlds in a way that seemed almost orchestrated by fate. Michael's eyes widened in recognition as he scanned the faces of the three men. These weren't random criminals targeting his estranged father. These were the very gang members whose photographs were pinned to his investigation board at the precinct. For months, Michael had been working as a detective in the organized crime division, building a case against an extortion ring operating throughout the district. The thugs scrambled for the exit, but Michael had not come alone. The moment he recognized the leader's distinctive scar, he had called for backup. Police cars pulled up outside, blocking all potential escape routes. The sting operation Michael had been orchestrating for nearly a year had coincidentally aligned with his father's desperate call for help. As officers led the men away in handcuffs, father and son stood in stunned silence amid the wreckage of the store. The truth emerged gradually between them. Michael's transfer to Oak Ridge's police department 6 months ago wasn't coincidental. He'd been tracking this extortion ring targeting small businesses throughout the district, but never realized his own father had become a victim. In the days that followed, evidence from Frank's case helped prosecutors connect these thugs to a larger criminal network that had been terrorizing small businesses. Arrests were made at various levels of the organization, and the neighborhood slowly reclaimed its sense of security. More importantly, father and son rebuilt their relationship. Michael began stopping by for coffee each morning before his shift, making up for the years lost between them. Their shared ordeal had broken down walls that grief had built, allowing them to rediscover the deep connection they had always shared beneath their differences. Frank continued to run his store, though now with occasional help from Michael on his days off. Sometimes the most unexpected calls for help bring the most unexpected resolutions. And what about you? If faced with intimidation and threats to something you've built over a lifetime, would you stand your ground or walk away?